what's going to take more effect in our churches? It probably is going to be work on defining and clarifying pathways of localized, contextualized, thoughtful, compassionate discipleship within our local spaces, more than maybe sermon prepping.
Welcome to the Fresh Expressions Podcast, Season 6. I'm your host, Heather Jalad. I'm a pastor and cultivator of Fresh Expressions, new faith communities that strive to reach new people in unexpected places. In Season 6, we're diving into discipleship, exploring what it means to follow Jesus and share Jesus in our everyday lives, and how churches can cultivate a culture of discipleship that is more than curriculum within their communities. Along the way, we'll be talking with church leaders and practitioners in the Fresh Expressions movement about the crisis of discipleship the church is navigating. We hope you will love this episode. And if you've benefited from this podcast, can you help us spread the word? Leave a review on Apple Podcasts or just share your favorite episode with a friend or colleague or on social media. Now, let's start the conversation. Well, welcome back to the Fresh Expressions podcast. I am excited to kick off this new season of the podcast centered on discipleship. Now, one thing I think is that has brought me back again and again and again to this conversation around discipleship is the word that came out from the Barna Group in 2020 about how 1 in 3 practicing Christians just stepped away from church attendance at the beginning of 2020. And now some of us might say, church attendance and discipleship, Heather, what do those have in common? And I think, we could just spend hours in that conversation. But I will say from the churches that I work with, that more and more often we have equated church attendance with discipleship. And so, I think that just kind of lays the foundation for our conversation today with our guest on the podcast, Eun Strawser, Eun, however you would like for me to address you. I didn't even ask you how to address you, but would you please introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself before we dive into this conversation?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Heather. Thank you for having me on the podcast. If you write a book, then this is a thing that you probably would love talking about for hours on end. So I love talking about centering discipleship in the real life church for hours on end. Thank God for podcasts and good podcasts, right? My name is Eun Strawser. My big tag intro is I'm a co-vocational lead pastor of a church in Honolulu, Hawaii. This is my second church plant. My husband and I, we've been here in Hawaii for about 15 years now, raised all 3 of our babies here, and we moved from Philadelphia. So I actually grew up, did all my formative years, fell in love, had all my babies in West Philly. Everyone's going through that song in their head right now, I think when you write a book like this, that feels like, discipleship is such a loaded word. It's one of those words where in Christendom, as soon as you hear it, every single person has already a formed thought about it. So if you're going to write a book like this, then I think that it needs to be clear. It needs to be anchored to a real community. So in so many ways, centering discipleship really is a love letter to this church plant, my church that I am so blessed to lead and love. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yes, I told Eun when I picked up her book, I wished that she had written it before I wrote my dissertation, because I would have loved that, because it really does take discipleship and move it from the periphery and from thinking programmatically, because I do think that when we talk about discipleship in the church, we tend to think programmatically about discipleship and moves it to the center of the church and the community and how we can think like when we do think about discipleship, we do tend to think programmatically and think, well, what works in this church will work in my church. And we think in a sense of like plug and play. And even, you use the word pathway in your book. And I think we can even, in a sense, think pathway and think, well, I can somehow graduate or get to a destination of sorts, right? Like, but you really speak to how discipleship happens in community and relationship, right? And there's a mutuality to that, which I think is so important and so missed. Like we have something to give one another and share with one another and learn from one another. And that it is something that it's a journey that we continue on and is contextual, right? Like what works in one place with one group of people is going to be different than what works in another place. So unpack that a little bit for our listeners.
I think you are probably the most concise person describing what this book is all about. So Heather, kudos to you. I think that the loadedness in the word discipleship happens because of those two bookends. We either extremely privatize it, and therefore we think that discipleship is just meant one-on-one with me and Jesus, right? And that's it. So keep everybody out of it. There's no formation within the community, and it's just a depicting a relationship between me and Jesus. And it just can't be true if Jesus himself discipled a group of people from the onset, right? On the other hand, we can universalize the term discipleship so much that, quite frankly, the church has done this. This is why there are so many assimilated churches, and colonized churches in the world, saying that my impression of who Jesus is and my cultural experience is this is the real Jesus and this is the only Jesus, right? The whole white Jesus phenomenon, right, in the world today. So a lot of conversations around discipleship really just happens in one or the other place. And so I think that it really is, for the leader, this is probably where our work actually needs to be focused on more than anything else. Can I just say that it could be maybe, as a preaching pastor, more work done thinking about and putting up a framework and pathways of localized, contextualized, thoughtful, compassionate discipleship within our local spaces, more than maybe sermon prepping, right? What's going to take more effect in our churches? It probably is going to be work on defining and clarifying what discipleship is. So that really is a nutshell about the book. There has to be universal pieces about what discipleship is. Every Christian should be able to identify another Christian in another part of the world. I'm in Hawaii, and a Christian in Ghana should be able to identify that I'm a Christian and that person is a Christian too, right? So you're trying to think through what actually quantifies or qualifies what being a Christ follower is across the entire planet. But then you have to think, okay, what kind of impact does that make on my local place?
That's right. Gosh, there's so many wheels spinning in my head as you're talking. I mean, certainly as a leader within a church, as a pastor within a church, really moving from this idea of solo heroic leader, that is, kind of just, sharing the message, which can be, frankly, I mean, been there, done that. I've been the lead pastor, neat and tidy. to actually intersecting with the lives of people. And I'm not saying that lead pastors don't do that. I mean, don't hear me wrongly, but getting down in the nitty gritty and actually having to intersect with the lives of people and contextualizing what it is that we're preaching and having to practice that and adapt and adjust and all of those kinds of things, kind of down in the trenches with the people, is a whole different ballgame. And And I just think that there's something that there's hard work to be done there, to be sure.
Yeah, I think hard work is going to be hard work. I don't think centering discipleship makes the work any easier. Don't get me wrong. It isn't. It's also hard work. But I think that it's not really about what the work energy or work focus level should be. It really is. I think for any lead pastor who's listening to this, my biggest thing for all of us, right, in these positions to lead and love. What a privilege to lead and love the people God has given us, right? But if we're in those roles in these people's lives, then I think we have to rethink and sort of uproot what is it that my leadership is intending to do, right? I think so much of leaders, senior lead pastors, in those positions, most of the time we talk about sabbaticals, being burnt out, right? Because the work is so hard. Yes, the work is hard, but it probably is because our assumptions is that a church worship service, which I love. I love attending a worship service. I love it so much. I love that corporate worship space. But if our assumption is that worship space and that worship space alone is going to do the lion's share of work to meet the needs of people's, own intimacy with God, their own personal connection with one another, their own sense of wholeness, and what their participation and renewal in the city around them is supposed to be, then we are probably really, really, really thinking so highly of our services. I don't think that there is a worship service, even in the best of churches, that does all four of those things 100% for 100% of their attendees.
That's right.
So the Sunday worship service is not meant for that. It's probably meant for something else, right? So defining discipleship is not happening in a Sunday morning worship service. Then you ask, where is it happening? It should be happening in a different kind of location within the life of the church.
Yeah. And it's in those it's in everyday life, in the everyday places and spaces where we live, work, eat, play, right? And then how does that translate into those spaces so that it does become transformational, not only in our own lives, but in all of the relationships that we have and all the spaces that we live and move and have our being, right? So, the other thing that I'm just thinking when we're talking about, the solo heroic leader is, this place where I think we can forfeit the possibility of apprenticeship and mentorship. And, Jesus worked himself out of a job in a sense, right? Like he knew he was preparing his disciples for when he left. And, the text that I go back to again and again, that I think we go back to in the Fresh Expressions movement again and again, is Luke 10, where he sends out the 70 or the 72. I mean, again, he is just multiplying the mission through his followers. And I mean, that is what we're meant to do as leaders in the church. Like, how do we apprentice the people around us? I love the metaphor, the living metaphor that you use in your children, and how, as they get older, as they get to a certain age, that they go and hike the mountain, and that, each year is a different experience because they're stronger. They know the path a little bit better. They have a different perspective because they have lived experience of the year behind them. And maybe they're a little taller, so they see things a little differently. It's such a great metaphor for the journey of faith. So talk a little bit about like the pathway and how you really argue for like returning to it yearly and what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that your point about apprenticeship and mentorship is really important. I think that it is a distinction that we have to be clear about, because the other thing about I think the mistake that a lot of leaders make in wanting to be gung-ho about, okay, now I'm going to center discipleship and therefore I'm going to rush into this. There is a pacing that is required for this. There is also this expectation that it's not going to produce leaders. It's not going to produce, your next replacement, right? Discipleship, we need to also take it outside of this journey that it's going to produce. It's some sort of leadership pipeline within the church, right? That only the best disciplers or those who are discipled are those who are meant to be the next leaders of the church. No. If you again go back to even Luke 10, but also the Great Commission, Jesus is giving it to all of his disciples, all of his followers, right? There isn't a distinction of skill sets. There's actually a really, really heavy emphasis on lack of skills and lack of preparation and lack of experience, right? It really is that personal connection, mesmerized, changed, transformed at the forefront by Jesus himself, right? And that really is the only criteria. Really, if you're a follower of Jesus and you said yes to him, boom, guess what? You're not just a disciple of Jesus, you also are equipped and will be equipped to disciple others. It's not a leadership pipeline. It's not some sort of manuscript or blueprint for people, for churches to get more leaders within their church. It really, again, it's another underlying assumption that discipleship either is super privatized or it's some sort of method to produce more leaders, but it's not. It's trying to define what kind of impact and transformation will every Jesus follower or soon to be Jesus follower, or will be one day Jesus followers within your church and at large within your community, what will they experience, right, as Jesus followers? And what will their community, their family, their work settings, their schools, all these things have an impact on because they're Jesus followers, right? Those are very different questions from thinking about, how do we have every single person have a meaningful personal experience of God in a worship setting versus how do I use this tool so that I can gain people who are going to come and replace my job title, right? No, discipleship is meant for every single person. So is your church equipped to disciple every single person who comes through those doors or you have a contact point with? Are we thinking thoughtfully about current Jesus followers and soon to be Jesus followers? So this is why I think a pathway is so important and not a program, because a program doesn't fit all of those categories, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It changes every year. It changes, but definitely, certainly over decades, right? Our church started with, again, this is my second church plant, and I like to emphasize that because my first church plant, we did the full, literally, you can just put me into the plug and play, all-star church. You start with 20, volunteers. In 5 years' time, you grow the church to 450 people coming in and out every Sunday, and you're a rock star in Hawaii, right? Tiny church plant grew that big, right? And I think a lot of my questions around defining and clarifying discipleship happened in those years in that church setting. So fast forward, the second church plant, we just did it a very different way. It was really experimental, right? And again, this is the gift of church plants over inherited churches, right? You get to have a little more gumption to to do that. But even with my work with a lot of established churches, we think a lot thoughtfully through plans of how to begin to center discipleship within their own church context. But, you start with a small group of people, Jesus followers, and then we grew it to, this is our 7th year now for one group to now we have 12. Spanning all across Oahu, and our youngest disciple who is being discipled intentionally through a pathway is 2 years old. It started with the youngest age is 8 years old. We were thinking second graders are, they have a learning ability. But now we've discovered that 2-year-olds can be discipled as well. And our oldest is 92 years old. So I think about a discipleship pathway that includes, probably a more authentic vision of what the kingdom of God is like, that it's multi-generational, that it includes lots of learning abilities, right? Different cultures, right? Hawaii is so diverse, so different cultures, right? You really are trying to think about how do we experience the kingdom of God together in community because we follow Christ.
Yes. And I think, you've hit on a number of things. I mean, that Luke 10 passage, I think, is so important because they are nameless people. And I just think that's so significant because all we do know about them is they likely were just spending time with Jesus. And I say just in quotations, right? They were spending time with Jesus and listening to Jesus. And that was the prerequisite, right? That was it. And I think the significance of the pathway and the ages and the the multiculturalism, which is our world, my goodness, and the context is so significant in and how you planted this church and how we approach Fresh Expressions as well. I mean, context, starting small, experimentation from within the inherited church that, what do we have to lose in being faithful to the gospel? And how discipleship and evangelism are inextricably linked together. And I think we do in the inherited church, and I mean, we do have a lot of baggage associated with evangelism, like we do with discipleship. We do tend to think transactionally as well, rather than relationally and transformationally. But those things are linked together, are inextricably linked together, and are a long obedience in the same direction, are, to borrow a phrase from Eugene Peterson, right? Like they are a journey. And therefore are, I think, difficult in a sense to measure, which is a lot of angst in the church today. Like our metrics need to shift, and people have a lot of anxiety around that. I think because our metrics that we continue to go back to are kind of what named you the rock star in your first plant, right? Like.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, so maybe how we got here, where we are in the church today. What do you think? How do we get here? Is it consumerism? Is it our cultural norms? Like, what is it? How do we get to where we are in the state of discipleship, where we are today? And then,
Heather,
I mean,
just
you
literally,
did all the
I'm
research.
just like
You wrote the books.
instant cries right now, just because it's such a loaded question. So I'm going to just keep myself together and have this conversation with you. I think one point is like, it's not the question. I think there's a second question too, like, what do we have to lose, right, in following Christ, right? I think the second question is like, what does our community, our neighborhood, our town, our city have to gain because we follow Christ, right? I think it's the second question that we don't ask. And there's such a loss to the church's experience, I think, to a Christ follower's experience, because we don't ask that second question, right?
Yeah.
If the metric is only going to be what will be our personal gain, then I'm sorry, friends, discipleship just will not happen, right? If discipleship's, even how Jesus depicts discipleship and puts metrics around what it means to actually follow him, that it's going to come at a cost to you. There's already an expectation that it's not going to be just for your own personal gain. And yet you will inherit the entire world, right? Like an abundance that you have never experienced before. If we don't really trust Jesus on his words, right? And we don't really trust Jesus that he's out to do this within community, right? His last words to his beloved disciples, right? Everything he's banking his crucifixion and resurrection on is that, hey, the only way that the world will know who I am, if you really want, speaking of evangelism, right? If you really want the world to know who I am, they're actually not going to listen to your words. They're going to pay attention to how you treat one another.
That's right.
Every epistle of the Apostle Paul, those letters, if you go through them over and over, he is talking about relationships, or how the church members, these little house churches all over this expanding globe, right? How these people are treating one another, because he knows that an outside world is paying attention, right? How we're treating one another and treating our neighbors. That's it. So if you're thinking about if our discipleship isn't equipping the Christians in our midst that we are so privileged and honored to lead and love, if they're not just being equipped in, like, the church, I think, is good at doing a spiritual confidence, right? We know to mature and grow people and followers of Jesus in spiritual confidence. But if that spiritual confidence is not tethered really, really, really securely to social competence, do Jesus followers know how to act like Jesus in the world today, right now? Not they're just waiting and twiddling their thumbs for cashing their golden ticket to go to heaven. Not that Christian, right? Not the retirement country club Christian, but do they know how to live like Jesus right now? If their social competence isn't being intentionally equipped gosh, we are not discipling our people,
That's
right? They
right.
should not just be coming in hungry because they're like, I don't know. Teach me about the Bible. The Bible is
Yes.
awesome. Trust me, I'm such a Bible nerd. We all are probably, right? And we
Yes.
want to
Yes.
be. But if that is the one criteria to say that that person is a Jesus follower, you know, Jesus himself said that the Satan, right, knew
I heard
God's
somebody
word
say we're all
inside and
about
out.
I heard somebody say we're all about 3,000 Bible verses overweight. We need to start
uh,
working them off.
that's so good. That's so good.
Um, yeah, and I think to your point that we don't graduate and we don't retire. And frankly, I mean, I think we are one of our growing um, gifts of the church is our aging population, and I continuously hear that where we're retired or we're tired, and I just think there's such wisdom there that is untapped, and I just wonder how we can activate that part of our churches. I mean, again, when we talk about the inherited church and the gifts that are there, many of them lie in those folks. And I don't know if you have any genius ideas about, how we can activate that segment of our churches. If I would love for you to share what's working in your world.
Yeah, I think it probably goes to that question about what is stopping the church today. And
Yeah.
I speak, and actually, most of the time we're just assuming it's a Western church, right? I do work
Yeah.
both in the U.S. and the U.K., but really, my conversations with those in like West Africa, East Africa, they are coming to that same point, right? That they're like,
Mm,
we don't know how to figure out the discipleship piece, right? We
yeah.
figured out the church part, but we haven't figured out the discipleship piece, right?
Yeah.
And so these are conversations I think happening in the church, the world around, right? And when we think about it, every theologian, every biblical scholar, every Christian leader, in the West, we have to contend with the fact that we are dealing with not just a consumeristic culture, but post-pandemic and beginning with millennial generations, right? There's a different wiring about how we keep our schedules and our calendars, right? So there's lots of hurdles around it because of people being people, and thinking about how people behave in groups, all those kinds of things. I think that leaders should think about the church like how sociologists think about the city. We should learn about our people, right? There's an exegesis
Yes.
work that we should not just do within our city because evangelism is important. We should actually do an exegesis, digging
Mm,
work and discovering what is the culture of our church. Because then you're going to find out a lot of reasons for why discipleship can't be centered, what things that you
mm,
might have to address in it, right? Some people, a lot of leaders, they think that, especially in inherited churches, they ask, an older generation of people, my congregants, they don't want any change, right? And
right.
therefore, they get really grumpy and all these things. And I'm always just like, and I'm guilty of this too. This is why I share this with most of these leaders. But I'm like, I think that we have to listen to Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he makes that big stake, right? That he's just like, leaders should never complain about their people. And leaders
Mm,
should, for sure, never complain about their people to God, right? If we're
mm,
in that place of resentment, we have to actually consider where are our congregants now. The first piece of advice about centering discipleship is not coming up with some grand pathway. That's fun work to do. The first step in centering discipleship, actually for the leader, is to consider who has God already given me to lead and
mm,
love. If
yeah.
you are instantly thinking about, I need a change of people or a change of guard or a different place to lead, I'm like, I don't think you should be leading then, right? That's a heart work that
Wow.
you have to do with Jesus, right, about it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're
Mm-hmm.
in that position to lead and love, man, you better start considering who has God already given you to lead and love. And most people when you give them a wonderful vision of discipleship, which vision casting is the leader's role. We should be excellent at this
Yes.
and very clear about it, right? When we're giving that, we also have to consider every person who is thinking about doing something new, this change and all this stuff. But this is post-pandemic. Change has been very difficult
That's
for
right.
everybody across the globe.
That's right.
If we don't consider that this is a post-pandemic season in humanity's life, then we will miss out on how to speak the same language to our people who have experienced so much loss. They have to think about what will I lose, and will I be lost in the midst of this? A lot of our older congregants, they will be always asking that because they live in a society that misses them and
That's
leaves
right.
them behind, right? So you have to consider, does my vision casting and discipleship actually include them? It doesn't need to platform them, put them at a higher place. It's not about all those kinds of things, but does it actually include the people that God has given you to lead and love? That is the first task of a leader, right?
That's really good. Two things. Okay. Immediately, I think of Moses. God, you've given me these stubborn, stiff-necked people. I'm sorry. But anyway, but then I also think about when, when pastors have, quote unquote, exegeted their congregation, but they're looking for what can I get from who? And, who is the administrator, who has the financial experience, who has the real estate experience, who has this, that, rather than what is this person passionate about? What brings this person to life? What is, and how those passions and gifts are intrinsically, woven into the fabric of who they are and how God has uniquely positioned them within that community of faith and within that community, and are meant to be absolutely a part of their discipleship, and and how those things can come into play. I think that's what we're missing, and we're not really looking for.
Yeah, I think even thinking about that, one of the most common questions that I get asked from churches I work with is, especially with inherited churches, like, okay, how do I start? All this stuff. Do an experimental discipleship core group. Blah blah blah. Wonderful, great. But then the question is like, who do I ask? I'm like, well, your first group, especially in an inherited church, is going to be an important group. There's a church that I worked with in Portland, Oregon, and the lead pastor was super passionate, gung-ho, like high capacity leader. I just love this guy so much. And he was like ready to go. Okay, and we're going to set up a discipleship core, and in 1 year time, we're going to get rid of a Sunday morning worship service. I'm like, whoa. Your church is like one of the, but probably the one and only historically multicultural Black church in the Portland, Oregon area, sitting on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Like, you have a legacy, and a whole slew of people who have worked in this community to honor, right? That's the first thing, right? Especially for inherited churches, you have to think about what the church's history has been like, right? So you start there, and then you don't do this in a year, right? You make sure that you at least 3 years to begin to think about, what do these discipleship cores look like? Who are you going to be inviting? So we planned out a really, really simple discipleship pathway. We took 6 months doing that work, but then when he was able to launch it, he invited his whole church, open invitation, just thinking that he's going to have like maybe 10 to 12 people. The entire church showed up. They love this church and they love this community. So he came back and he's like, oh my gosh, and I'm so excited. Everyone's going to be discipled. I'm like, whoa. Let's just start with an experimental group on purpose.
That's right.
Get all the mistakes out, right? Have these people, but you want to know who's going to be in that first group. So when they're deciding, it's not going to be all staff or paid leaders, right? Or visible leaders, right? Probably a rule of thirds are great. A third of that kind of group, because they're decision makers in the church, right? Then you think about who has a relational authority. right? You know the people. As soon as they send a text out, everybody says yes.
That's right.
You know what I mean? There's a
Mm-hmm.
gift in that. These are probably all the shepherds in your mix, right? People love these people. That's why they hang out with them. So a third of people who have like some sort of relational authority within the church. And then another
Mm-hmm.
third are the people who have like a spiritual authority. They're not really the decision makers. They may not be the most popular or people, but they're the people who are like holders of wisdom. They're the people when people are in crisis, they go to these people, right?
That's right.
These are probably the people who have experience in years also, right? You bring these people together, disciple them using a discipleship pathway, get all the work out of it, right? Because it's going to be new. How does it impact their, their personal wholeness, their intimacy with God, their participation in renewal in the city and the neighborhood around them, and their communal life, right? If it's working with those for a year, he did that. And then the next year, they multiplied to 3 different groups. It wasn't the whole church yet because it wasn't year 3 yet. But then after that point, then they started asking questions around, what are these groups supposed to do? They didn't know. Despite just being discipled very clearly about these things, they just didn't know. So then we're like, okay, let's just experiment. Right on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, there were 3 places that they could already identify in their own discipleship journey together. They knew that right next door of the church was a low-income senior living facility. So one group just adopted them and just asked questions of their neighbors. Hey, how could we be involved? Write letters, do visits, needs, all those kinds of things. The second group was like, there's an elementary school down the street. How can we just make ourselves more available for just a year, just to experiment it out, right? And the third group is like, there's the first Black-owned coffee shop, Black female-owned coffee shop right across the street in years. We'll just partner with her. So they started just doing that. They're simple things, right?
Yes.
People don't, but I'm just like, they are growing in their spiritual confidence as they're following and imitating Jesus, but it's so strongly tethered to their social competence. They discovered who their neighbors are. They discovered talking to their neighbors, asking about their needs.
Actually
how do we be a neighbor,
them,
right?
Asking them questions. Yeah.
All those things, right?
I love it. That's good. So I'm hearing a couple things here. I'm hearing like the metrics that we need to be using are, people knowing who we are because of how we love each other and how we care for each other. And the metric of really, using what's in your hand. What has God provided you? What are the unique gifts, location, right? Like, and season really that you're in, people that God has given you. I know another thing that you mention is like asking the question, how do you know when you've been discipled? And I want you to talk about that in just a minute. And then I also want us to get to like 2 to 3 things that you would really invite pastors to consider as far as kind of moving into moving discipleship from the periphery to the center. And you've talked about kind of taking your time to develop a discipleship pathway and really literally taking your time and then having that pilot group. So firstly, how do people know when they've been discipled? And then 2 or 3 things potentially for pastors to start doing to move discipleship to center.
Yeah, I think most people, especially in the United States and in the UK, would all say, I don't know if I've been discipled. It's a really, really hard question to answer. And I think that is part of that work for the leader, right? Can you definitively say that you've been discipled? And then can you definitively say that you've discipled somebody else? It's a great commission for crying out loud. This is the one thing that Jesus left for every follower of his to do. Right? And yet we don't know how to do it, right? So I'm not going to beat the punch to divulge what I think that that's the work of the leader. Can they contextually be able to define what does it mean to imitate Christ so that we are maturing, but as a community? Is their entire community together maturing into the likeness of Christ? I'll answer that question with a story. For me, actually, the metric of discipleship, and if it's really happening, is probably way more higher than what most people think it is of me. I
Okay.
think that there is a baseline of if your church is actively actually centering discipleship, every single person is set up so that they have access to being intentionally discipled through a discipleship pathway that's localized to your context. If that's happening, there's going to be this personal transformation that's happening at that base level. It's beautiful, right? But I think that if we just stop there, discipleship metrics are just going to be, do our people feel really good about their spiritual lives, right? What a terrible metric to just stand on, right? I think the next thing is going to be, do the disciples in our midst actually begin to experience a communal transformation? Is the entire community transforming, right? Are people not just saying, I'm really patient, but like everyone's growing in patience with one another? Can you imagine an entire group of people who are the best at being patient, the best at addressing anxiety in the world, the best at people addressing loneliness, right? That's what they're being equipped in doing, right? A communal transformation happens. But even that still is not so great, because then we're going to be like a really nice social club that people can be invited
Right.
into,
We're
right?
really nice church. We're
Right.
really nice people.
Nice
We're really
people.
welcoming. Yeah.
Exactly, which is all wonderful things, right?
Yeah. Right.
But then I think the true metric is, does the city, neighborhood, or town or community do they actually experience transformation because your church exists? Is the city or community or neighborhood impacted because your church resides on their street, right?
That's right.
Or if your church sank in a hole, as my friend Josh Hayden would say, if it sank in a hole, would your neighborhood even notice, right?
Yeah.
So if that community, that city, town, neighborhood renewal isn't happening, then I don't think discipleship is actually happening. Lots of
Yeah.
good spiritual like things are happening, but a strong metric of, is discipleship being centered in your church, is because your city, town, neighborhood is also having a gain from discipleship happening, right? Are they actually experiencing flourishing with the church, and not because of the church? It's in despite of it, right? I think part of it is like, one of our communities, our groups of discipleship core, they, 7 years ago, they focused on just the low income senior living facility population within their neighborhood, walking distance for all these leaders, for this core group. And so fast forward through the pandemic, they probably didn't do not one Jesus-y thing with their neighbors except pray before pizza dinner for a bingo night multiple times a month, right? And so, but I'm like, okay, there's a pace that happens. What happens to this core group of people who see their mission as these wonderful senior neighbors, right? Low-income senior neighbors, right? What happens over the long haul because this is happening? Fast forward, the pandemic happens, right? And so this is a group that immediately mobilized. They weren't thinking, how do we streamline virtual pizza and bingo night for our neighbors? They're not doing that. They're crying to me, because they're like, our neighbors need to go on a public bus during March of 2020 every week to go to the food bank to pick up food and take the bus again and go back. And these are the most vulnerable in our society, right? Think March 2020, no vaccination, no nothing, right? People are making and sewing masks, right? And in that time, this group, because of a missional sense through their discipleship, they started providing 1 month worth of groceries for all 500 seniors in their neighbors for the entirety of the pandemic. This is what their mission became. Again, you still think, okay, lots of charitable goods, no Jesus-y things, right? The neighbors knew that they were Christians. On the other side of the pandemic now, we have discipleship cores in each of these low-income senior living facilities, right? There's community that's happening. The discipleship cores are not made up of young people are coming into these living facilities. It's all the senior residents. That's why we have people who are 92 years old thinking about how do I uproot gossip in my life because it's ruining my relationships within my community because it's not Jesus-like, right? They're having they're learning about the full gospel, right? Sharing it with their neighbors, right? All these things are happening. It still isn't the metric of discipleship until the city and county then called this group, and they're just like, we know you're Christian, but we also know that these places are flourishing. Could you start doing this in this other identified low-income senior living facility in Mo'ili, right? I'm like, if you want to know what the metric of discipleship is within your church, one of those metrics has to be your community, your neighborhood, your city is paying attention to what's happening in your church.
And then they start opening their doors to you and inviting you in because they see the impact that you're making. The gospel is making through you. So, I mean, kind of woven up in that is really maybe one or two things that churches could start doing or pastors could start doing to center discipleship in what they're doing already.
I think that the simple answer is I think the leader's job, and this is definitely you put your leader's hat on to hear this question, right? This response. I think the leader's job, we have three main things, right? We probably are the keepers of what the church focuses on, which means resources, time, leadership pipelines, finances, all those kinds of things, right? What the church's invitation is going to be, whatever the leader invites people to, people just come, whether we like to admit that or not. If people just do that, right? They want to follow, right? So invitation, and then lastly, vision. Do we actually think about in 5 years' time, what do we imagine our people to be? Does the 5 years' time people include city people, in the neighborhood, in, workers, in all this stuff? Or do we just think that in 5 years' time, I hope, pretty please, our church attendance will grow? If your 5-year goal, and you have to be so honest with yourself, right? But if your 5-year goal is that your church attendance will grow, then you have not included discipleship within that plan. So I think addressing, kind of looking at assessing where does my leadership put emphasis on, how does it interact with invitation, and how good am I in vision casting? If those things aren't centering discipleship, then no matter what programs or pathways or initiatives you want to put on, it just will not happen. It is the burden and I think gift of being a leader.
Thank you, Eun. Thank you so much. One of the things we ask our guests to do, this has been such a wonderful conversation, and I did not tell you this was coming, but one thing that we're going to start to do quarterly is a vision casting webinar. So hello, thank you. You just teed that up for us because it is so important. It is so important to our pastors and permission givers to be able to cast vision for what's possible and to be able to center our congregations forward and really God's preferred future for us. We have our ideas about what that looks like, but yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for this very, very important conversation and for kicking off this very important season for us. It has been really thought-provoking and one that I know folks will want to know more about. So we will include all of your contact information in the show notes. And the book is Centering Discipleship. I know everyone will want to pick up a copy if they don't have one already. Wonderful guidebook, very practical. Love the part, I think it's part 3, where you have even calendaring in some important rhythms and practices for the church. Really important for those lead pastors to take a look at too, and how you can begin to shift into centering discipleship. One of the things we ask our guests to do is to pray for our listeners. So would you close us out by praying?
I would love to. And thanks again for having me, Heather.
Thank you.
Jesus, I just thank you. I just thank you that you love your church. Thank you that you consider your church to be a bride that you want to present that's blameless and shameless. So I just pray that the conviction that we may be feeling, the challenge or comfort or encouragement that we may be feeling as leaders right now, that you would invite us to this great partnership with you in knowing how to present your church who are blameless and shameless. Would you give us a lot of courage, courage to follow you, courage to figure out what that looks like in our local place to follow you, courage to go into places that are so broken and probably not so comfortable, and courage to invite others into those places. So in your good name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Fresh Expressions is a worldwide movement of everyday missionaries who want to see churches thrive in the places we live, eat, work, and play by leveraging the creativity and endurance of the inherited church. To learn a simple 5-phase process for starting a new expression of church, go to freshexpressions.com/how-to-start. Want to learn more from the Fresh Expressions team? Head over to freshexpressions.com/training to learn ways we can work together to provide coaching, training, and inspiration for your church or organization. Jump into our monthly trail marker check-ins. The Pioneer cohort are launching this spring for your Fresh Expressions team, the Team Cultivator. You can also get more resources like this on FX Connect, an online community full of other church leaders passionate about reaching new people in new places. Access our entire library of practical and inspiring training materials and connect with other church leaders at fxconnectus.org. Season 6 of the Fresh Expressions podcast is hosted by me, Heather Jalad. It's edited by Joel Limbaum and produced by Jeanette Statz and Kathleen Blackie. Our senior director is Shannon Kaiser. If you've learned something or been encouraged by this podcast, please help us spread the word. You can give us a review on Apple Music or Spotify and share this episode on social media. Now may God bless you in your work for the kingdom.